Okay, so it is now 1 minute past 7, and we'll call this January 6, 2025 meeting of the Master Plan Working Group to order. We'll begin with a roll call. Bob Carroll,
Hi, Bob's here.
Victoria Duckworth,
Here.
Lindsay Fox,
Here.
Anne Marie Foley,
Here.
Deborah George, Brian Houle, Chantel Kimball, Essex Petrie, David Robbins is present, Sue Robbins,
Here.
Colleen Roy.
Here.
All right, that makes 7 members present, which is sufficient to constitute a quorum. So welcome everybody to the new year and the continuation of our work, and hopefully we'll be looking forward to having this work completed before the end of 2025. First item on our agenda, first action item, is approval of meeting minutes. We have minutes for September 30th available for review. They were posted to the website. Everybody have a chance to review them. Is there a motion towards approving them?
Move we approve the meeting minutes from September 30th, 2024 as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? I had one nit to on that. The under the housing chapter, under the last major bullet item updates, safe harbor achieved due to 160 Upton Street project. I believe that 160 was intended to be 116. It's the only thing I noticed in the minutes that needed to be updated.
Can I amend my motion to include the changes as presented?
If the seconder is willing to agree to that.
Seconded.
Excellent. So any further discussion of the motion? Hearing none. Mr. Carroll. Now, what happened to Bob?
We lost him.
Ms. Duckworth.
Aye.
Ms. Fox.
Aye.
Ms. Foley.
Foley, aye.
And I see that Chantel Kimball has joined us, so you get to vote on the motion. Ms. Kimball?
Was it just to approve minutes?
Yes.
Okay, aye.
Mr. Robbins votes aye. Ms. Robbins?
Aye.
Ms. Roy?
Aye.
All righty, motion carried unanimously. On to the next item. Since our last meeting, we've had 3 individuals resigning from the committee: Linda Hassinger, Doreen DeFazio, and Julie Grace. By submitting their resignation, they've been removed from the list of active committee members. But number one, the committee should be aware of this, and number 2, a motion for the committee to send their thanks for participation and regrets of learning about the resignation.
That the committee accept Linda Hassinger, Doreen DeFazio, and Julie Grace's resignation and send them a letter of appreciation.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. Let's see. Mr. Carroll is about to join us. We'll give him a moment. Bob, we're just voting on the motion to accept the resignations of the 3 members.
Okay, sorry, I got the blue screen of death. Haven't had that in a while.
My sympathies. All right, so you vote on the motion?
A. Accept.
Ms. Duckworth? Yeah. Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Foley,
Foley, aye.
Ms. Kimball,
Aye.
Mr. Robbins votes aye, Ms. Robbins,
Aye.
and Ms. Roy.
Aye.
Motion carried unanimously. We'll move into the discussion item agenda. We have the second draft of 2 chapters to review. We'll let
Mr.
Sarah and
Chairman.
company take the lead on this. Ms. Robbins?
Yes, I was just wondering if the minutes for November 6th and December 2nd are ready for approval. I have them on my agenda.
Yes, Fiona?
We weren't able to, thanks Sue for bringing that up. We weren't able to get them done in time, unfortunately. And that was after, we thought we were going to be able to meet that deadline, but fortunately
Okay.
no, but we should have all of them done by the next meeting.
Thank you.
All right, anything else before we move into the chapter drafts? Okay, so Elena and Sarah, I guess you guys can sort of kick this off. You know, which chapter draft do we want to discuss next? And
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, so
Mhm.
unfortunately, we were not able to complete edits for open space and recreation for this time. We'll leave this chapter for the next meeting. So we'll start with the next item on the agenda. My colleague Rob will talk to us about transportation. So we'll go through the revisions of the transportation chapter.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Great to meet you for the first time. So we did have a number of revisions in the matrix to take a look at. Elena, I don't know if you want to pull it up or anything, but I think a lot of them were to kind of help take the chapter and link it back to some previous plans that had gone on in town. Noting the open space and recreation plan and some recent plans that have been done. So we went back through it and looked at that. One of the recommendations was to move from recommending a full study around the town common and more so looking at some of the past plans and seeing some of the recommendations they had in it and trying to incorporate it. Perfect. Yeah. So it was kind of looking at some of those different feasibility solutions and trying to ground them in the past plans. But there definitely does seem like there's still some appetite in the town to look around the town common area, which is kind of a challenging historic area in town. So we're still looking at trying to do some of the work around the town common, recommending taking a look at the parking. See here. So one of the main action items was changing the preparation of a transportation study for the common into actually focusing on the implementation of findings from previous and pending traffic studies. So we did update that change. We did note that there's a lot of work that's been done around low impact development and how that impacts transportation. The town of Grafton, like many central Mass towns, has seen a lot of warehouse development in recent times, and that certainly has a big impact on the transportation network. So looking at some of the rules and regulations around subdivisions and other developments and trying to incorporate those low impact development principles, whether it be trying to incorporate transit into the development. Grafton does have a pretty strong transit presence with its shuttle routes provided by the WRTA, or if it's something like trying to reduce the number of parking spaces that are actually built as part of the development. And then just scrolling down a little bit, linking the transportation chapter with some of the open space and recreation pieces that the town has been going through. A big piece of that is the Blackstone River Greenway. There's kind of Grafton's kind of in the section of the Greenway that is kind of in limbo to be developed. The route is still being worked on a little bit. So incorporating that into the master plan was important because as we're seeing a lot of these larger scale long distance bike trails get developed, it's kind of in a way becoming a new form of transportation. So we're seeing a lot of those long distance routes like the Mass Central Rail Trail or the BWALT that's being built that's looking at taking or providing the opportunity for people to walk or ride their bike or another alternative mode of transportation, through many different towns. So incorporating that into this master plan, I feel like is very important. Let's see here, scrolling down. I think another important aspect that we worked on following the comments were some of the burdens I think that are being put on the town, especially the Department of Public Works, because the DPW is kind of being asked to maintain all of this infrastructure. They're being asked to maintain their current infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, but then when we're expanding sidewalks, looking at new forms of transportation through bikeways, multi-use paths, things like that, there's an added burden on them to maintain this infrastructure, whether it's maintaining it in good condition or clearing snow and ice from it. And with that, Grafton is an MS2 community, so there's certain requirements on them to do maintenance on their drainage infrastructure, street sweeping regularly, things like that, that are kind of these unfunded mandates. So one thing that we recommended, and unfortunately, it's not really something that can be done as part of this chapter, is to look at, whether the DPW and the other parts of the town government that are asked to maintain this infrastructure, really have the funding that they need to do so. Because we see in our transportation work that towns just don't have enough money to maintain just the simple pavement they have on their roads. And when you're, asked to get some of this more specialized equipment, it's really impossible for them to maintain it. So we think it's a good idea to look into whether or not there actually is, the funding available, the people available, and then following that, as this stuff is built out, it would be important to make sure that there's a kind of a maintenance aspect considered as, the network is continuously developed. Let's see here. And then just kind of trying to recommend some different ways for safe routes to school. That was an important aspect that seems to have been brought up, and it's also important for the safe systems approach, which has really been weaved throughout the transportation master plan. So we talk about trying to get the town more involved in the Safe Routes to School program. They actually already have a TIP project being funded kind of through the Safe Routes to School program, which is great, but just kind of talks about how the more involvement that a town has in some of these programs, the better the opportunity is for them to get funding. And really, the Safe Routes to School program is a great way to improve safety, not only for kids getting to school, but really for all road users, as improving those infrastructures. It's not just if I were to walk down the street, they're going to say, you're not a school kid, you can't walk on the sidewalk. It's really a sidewalk for everyone. So those were kind of some of the main topics that I feel like really came out in the in the comments that we had received. So I don't know if there's anything else that anyone would like to discuss or.
And this is Fiona, town planner. I just wanted to thanks Rob for going through that and kind of walking us through some of these comments. I don't have anything additional. I think the only thing that I would just reiterate, which you've done and CMRPC has been continuing to do, is just bearing in mind what we have kind of currently going on in town, because there are quite a lot of things, as you mentioned, the TIP project that DPW is working on, the common traffic assessment work, and just kind of how that relates to the long-term goals and objectives of what we're trying to accomplish in town. So, but yeah, great job. Thank you so much.
Yeah, reading through this, I noticed a couple of essentially typos. I'll add those to the comment workbook. I don't need to spend any time discussing them tonight unless someone really wants to. Let me just check my notes here. Anything? Let me see. All right, I think the only thing that I'll mention tonight, and again, this is a little bit of offline work to figure this out, but under goal 3, an example of multimodal resources being disconnected and fragmented. The document shows or states as an example of this is the lack of sidewalks on Carroll Street, actually Carroll Road, leading towards the Grafton Station. And to me, that's not a very good example, because adding sidewalks to Carroll Road doesn't really help as far as access to the T station is concerned, because that would never be on a walking route to the T station, which is another 3 miles past the end of Carroll Road. But I started in my notes on this, thinking there probably are some good examples of multimodal resources being disconnected. I don't know any off the top of my head, but I was thinking of things like sparse bus routes and bus stops where we have them, but they're few and far between and don't connect very well. We have discontinuous sidewalks in places where walking would be feasible if we had sidewalks. And we can talk about the lack of bike lanes also, sort of contributing to disconnected and fragmented multimodal resources. So I think it's a good thing to mention here that what we have for multimodal resources aren't as plentiful as we would like, and they're not connected as well as we like. And that's a good point to make. I just like to use a good example to make the point.
Yeah, absolutely. We can take a look at that and maybe even build out a little like a table or something that lists a few different examples.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't need to attempt to exhaustively list all the issues here, but at least a couple of examples to illustrate the point would be helpful. I just that as an example didn't strike me as a good example to illustrate the point. Colleen?
I have a good example. It's not near the train station, but Elmwood Street, that's the street I live on, has sidewalks on either end, and it's close to a school, but in the middle, there's no sidewalk. So if you could connect it all the way, and then more kids could walk to school.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of that does make for an appropriate example of it. Not so much. I mean, walking to access the T station is, that's kind of just sort of limited in its applicability, but more broadly, examples like Colleen just brought up are the kind of thing that I had in mind that would make good examples. Brian?
Yes, thank you, Dave. Carroll Road, in terms of example to the T station, you're right. It's a stretch to call it a good example. But I would say, as an example, Carroll Road would be to access downtown. It's only a mile from Stop and Shop. It's right an important way to get to the school for a lot of people in this neighborhood. So, it does. I guess it could get into, although it doesn't go to the T, in terms of a good example, but those types of things, in terms of getting into the downtown area and also to the school. That's
Yep.
all.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, right. So Carroll Road, just as Carroll Road is not entirely inappropriate here. It's just that what value would adding sidewalks to Carroll Road have? Exactly as you say, Brian. Fiona.
And just another point, I think there's a big push in town for sidewalks for obvious reasons. The sidewalk network, as we've discussed, it's disjointed, and a lot of main thoroughfares could benefit from having them. But in talking to DPW, because this is kind of always on our radar, the big thing and things that we don't think of, or like, or that the average person wouldn't think of, is that you're having to upgrade drainage alongside sidewalks as well, because you're adding, impervious surface and curbing, and that's going to create a significant flow of water. And then you start talking MS4, and then we're getting into. So I think that's, I think that what we're discussing here is key thoroughfares in town that, we would really like to see and focus on. And then with the long-term goal of maybe going out, but just because it is, and of course, a strip of sidewalk, it could only, is quite expensive even for just a small portion. So I'm always trying to think of how, and during this process, what makes the most sense now versus what makes sense 10 years from now and then 20, because hopefully at that point, the sidewalk network will gradually be built out. And but yeah, just kind of a food for thought. It's just from conversations that I've had with DPW director, because we recently had a town meeting article that was approved to try and find funding for sidewalks on Old Westboro Road, which is a long, pretty popular stretch in town, but it's all country, kind of like natural country drainage on that road. So it's been interesting to try and figure out how that's going to work. So just a comment there.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah, I'd say that with all the sidewalks that go into town from the South Street, North Street, from Church Street, from Millbury Road, from most of the roads that connect to the center of the town have sidewalks. I think Carroll Road is the only street that doesn't have a sidewalk that connects to town. So I'm going to push for that to be, brought up and put onto the long-term plan, because it's really the only street I think that doesn't have sidewalks, heading to town. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other comments on the transportation chapter here? Fiona?
I'm sorry, it's me again, but I would just love to have Ray, let me know if this is an overreach and maybe not something that's appropriate necessarily for the master plan, but I would love to have strong examples of things that that Grafton can do, especially when it comes to bike lanes. I find that it's been it's really tough unless it's on a state road, and unless you have a development that's coming before the town for a permit, and then we're trying to push for, hey, this location is on a main thoroughfare. We would really like to see a bike lane to connect or something like that. I feel like it's kind of piecemeal that these things come together. And I think, admittedly, I'm not I think I would be interested because I think we have a bicycle plan in town. There's a big push like regionally for more bike lanes, and Grafton obviously wants to do their part as well, as we've seen. But I would just love like, and we don't have to talk about it now, but examples of how that's been successfully done in some of these communities, and how like working with property owners, like should like certain people should the town planner, for example, be like addressing people. I guess I would love a little bit of that too. I think that would be super helpful, because any assistance or ideas to help implement some of these like larger scale things, I think is always a benefit. And same thing with rail trails. I have this like hang up about rail trails that I find them challenging.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Anne Marie?
Yeah, I just want to say I wholeheartedly agree with Fiona. I would love to see something in here, as brief as it may be, that at least we're thinking along those lines moving forward, and then connecting with, neighboring towns with their bike paths and whatnot.
I think we can definitely take a look at that. I know, City of Worcester's a little bit of a different example, but they've had a lot of success recently when they've been repaving, because they have these 4-lane roads that they really don't need to be 4 lanes, so they've been bringing them down to 2 lanes and putting in some cool infrastructure. I think Mill Street is a recent example, but might not exactly work in Grafton. But I think we might be able to try to find some smaller examples that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think, sort of, anything we can include in this chapter of the master plan, anything we can include to sort of, emphasize, among other things, that, yeah, we like roads, we like transit, sidewalks are, very, very visible, and, for as long as I lived in this town, people have been complaining about the lack of sidewalks, and so that's sort of a long-term emphasis. But trails as another form of transit. We pay a lot of attention to trails, but we haven't paid that much attention to bike transportation. So putting a little bit more emphasis on that, and planning ahead for the next 10 or 20 years to find opportunities to improve bike transit in Grafton. And yeah, it doesn't mean the same thing here as it might mean in Worcester or even some other towns with a different sort of a street network. A lot of our roads are old country roads, and there's really no opportunity whatsoever for even sidewalks, much less bike lanes. But to explore the possibilities that we can adapt to Grafton would be, I think, a good objective, or in the master plan somewhere. Anne Marie?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Just a caveat that this is timely, because starting in 2026, the Pan Mass Challenge will be coming through Grafton. It'll be a good way to see how thousands of bikers navigate South Grafton.
Yep, cool. Anything else on transportation? If not, well, and as I said earlier, I've got a few comments that I will add to the comment workbook. So if anybody else, as you continue to review it and think about it, particularly think about what we talked about tonight, you plug your comments into the comment workbook, and get the CMRPC staff to continue to work on this. It's looking pretty good so far. Anything else? If not, we'll move on to the next one.
And if I could add, if you could date your comments so that we make sure we keep track of what was added after we talked about the second round of edits, that would be very helpful. So if you can remember to do that, that would be great. We will move on to housing, and I think it's easier if I share my screen for this. My colleague Emily Blaubitz, who is in charge of our housing production plans, she wrote and edited this chapter. she responded directly to your comments, and I will do my best to talk about the edits that she made, but I may not be able to point to a specific comment. But I will just go through the main additions that she completed for this chapter. So I will start with an action item that points to conducting a suitability assessment for each village area, evaluating existing land conditions, built environment, and other factors that influence the development of multifamily housing. So this is specifically focused on the village area, and I wanted to bring up here, Fiona, if you think this may not be a good time to bring this up, we received a comment from Justin Hollander with this idea of incorporating this concept of new towns in how we approach density in specific areas in town. He was specifically looking at underdeveloped parcels. And, I think new towns have a specific history, a specific background. I don't know if we need to invoke new towns when we talk about housing, but I think if we are to pick up on that concept, and I don't know if the working group had a chance to review that, I think this would be the opportunity to do it, where we talk about the village centers and how we can concentrate development around the village centers and how we can analyze them for suitability. Obviously, this would involve a lot of infill. Justin's idea was looking at completely underdeveloped land. Fiona, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I just wanted to make a point that I think that this probably would be the most logical area to kind of evaluate that concept. And I think it makes, like, it's scalable, right? Like that this makes sense no matter what. I think, a suitability assessment for the potential for build out for these key areas in town is something, we always want to understand truly, like the real estate value and the market value and what we can, how we can properly capitalize on these areas in a way that makes sense for Grafton. So yeah, I just wanted to just kind of comment that I agree with you. I think this makes perfect sense. I just had a question as well, and I know you didn't write this chapter, so I can just shoot Emily an email as well. But is this looking at like land to like building values and like that type of ratio? Like I've seen that before in master plans where they'll do that type of analysis. Or is this just kind of?
We did that in the economic development chapter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that's fine, because that really was focused, or the discussion was focused on commercial. It's completely applicable to housing. I don't see why we couldn't refer back to that data. But yes, that's where we did that.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. I just wanted to make sure if that was kind of what we were looking at here, but this seems a little bit broader, and that specific kind of calculation is more lives in economic development. That's a good place for it. So thank you.
Yeah,
I think
sorry, David.
on this topic, if I may, the village centers that we'd be looking at, really there's they combine residential and commercial. And so the areas that we would be looking at and the ways we would be looking at them, really the residential angle and the commercial angle complement one another. And they really, at least in my conception of this focus on mixed use village areas, is that we really take a look at them, both at the same time. We look at it both from a residential and a commercial point of view. So there's really a close coordination between this particular spot in the housing and population chapter and the village center spot in the commercial, or the economic development chapter. And we kind of want to make sure that we've we understand the relationship there, that really each of those depends upon the other. And so, talking both about, what are the village centers, which I think we got into a little bit more detail on what the village centers are when we were talking economic development chapter a meeting or two ago. But we really want to sort of, look at these together. Like I said, when we're talking village centers, we're talking mixed use village centers that combine commercial and residential. So we want to make sure that in the master plan, we're sort of, we are connecting those two areas in a way that makes sense. And, the assessment that's on the screen now, I think you really want to look at both the residential and commercial aspects together on that. Changing the subject for a moment on Justin Hollander's new towns idea, his basic idea is to create a brand new village center on unused land. And there are some aspects of that make me skeptical about whether that concept can be made to work in Grafton. But again, here, when we're talking about existing village centers, to bring in the concept of maybe there's a place in Grafton where a new village center could be created. It's sort of, the idea is to take an area that's sufficiently large and appropriately located, and basically, let some developer, sort of go to town and sort of design a village from the ground up. And I think the idea has some merit. Again, there's not as much land in Grafton actually available for something like that as Justin might think there is. But still, if we're going to talk about that in the master plan, this is one place where we can talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for that point, David. And I think there are also market considerations for whether or not, and they go beyond the scope of this chapter, for whether or not a quote unquote new town or new village center could take root. Arguably, people look for acreage in Grafton, not necessarily high density living. And I think that could feasibly be done with infill. Again, we would have to do a market study for that, but to create a brand new village center is.
Like I said, I'm somewhat skeptical that idea could be made to work here, but it's probably worth at least exploring the possibility. But yes, there are a lot of factors. When I looked over that, Justin sent that to me. I don't know how widely he shared it, but anyway, when he sent that out, and I read through it, and I have a lot of questions about some of the details that would help to understand, is this something that could possibly be made to work? So Anne Marie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, given that we're spending time on this, I didn't see that document. I'm not sure if other people on the committee did.
Yeah, I suspect he didn't share it with the whole committee.
Yeah, I can actually answer that. So I can send that information. He sent me to he sent it to an incorrect email address for me, and I only kind of caught it later on. But I did tell him, I forwarded the comment to Elena and just said, this is something that he had mentioned it previously in, I forget which meeting it was, a few months ago. But yeah, I agree. I think we need to, the committee needs to kind of read the work and kind of understand a little bit more. I do like to make sure that I'm forwarding and honoring any comments that I get, just to make sure that I'm covering all my bases. But yeah, I mean, I again, CMRPC team, I think it might be probably beyond the scope of what we can do at this stage of the game. But I'll forward the information. I'll make sure it's part of the next agenda as well.
Yeah, and I would add, this could be achieved with zoning and zoning incentives. So you can certainly zone for that type of concept. I think if we are to discuss this concept, we have to talk about infrastructure. So that type of investment needs to be made along with
Mhm.
the proper zoning for something like this to take root. So I think we would need, in pointing out the feasibility of this concept, which is actually a good concept, that may work close to Boston, where, you know, there's a density of jobs. It may work in Grafton as well, but I think it's our responsibility to discuss, to call it into question in some ways.
Yeah, perhaps at most what we do in the master plan is sort of a brief description of the concept and kind of a list of what we can think of off the top of our heads as what would need to be evaluated and what might need to be done to make this a possibility. And yes, among my notes on that, infrastructure was there.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for that point. Maybe that's how we approach it. That, you know, a call to action in the sense that the town should evaluate feasibility. So yeah, that would be
Yeah.
probably.
I
Any
think
other-
I know what the result would be, but I don't want to prejudge anything.
And I mean, there are precedents. There's New Jersey, as Justin pointed out in his writing. So there's certainly precedents in the US. There's no,
Yep.
you know, it
It's
can be
just-
done.
It can be done. It's just, is it practical for here? And we don't,
Right.
we can't say that off the top of our head that we know it would be.
I will move on to the next chapter unless you, I'm sorry, next action item, unless you have any other questions on this topic. So David, to your point, we're definitely thinking of this in terms of mixed use, so both commercial and housing. And we're following up with action items that point to that. So the next one being implement regulatory changes that can be expected to incentivize higher density multifamily development, such as the expansion of village mixed use zoning and improvements to allow for greater flexibility, permitting multifamily residential, mixed use, and so on. So the next action item kind of ties into the previous one and gets at the regulatory changes that would be needed to achieve that. And Brian, you have a question?
Yes, the question I have is, I think back in 1988, we voted as a town, I wasn't here, but on combining lots. In other words, you had a quarter acre lot that was not going to meet the new specs of a half acre. You had to combine the property. And that happened with a number of properties in town, including one of the ones I own now. So in terms of the density question, are we addressing that in this overall plan? Because what that has done, especially in South Grafton, has taken away the ability in some spaces to maybe have more housing. You know, if you wanted to have more, which we do. And also with the 2006 initiative in going back and redoing what was an R3 district and making it residential 20, it took away from a few streets in the neighborhood in South Grafton to have the ability to have mixed use. So in some cases it makes sense, others it doesn't. So I'm wondering if this is examining those aspects of it as well. That's all.
So that is the intent of this action item, but we could specifically address that. We do address that in the land use chapter, but maybe we can address it in the terms that you've just outlined. So if you could leave that as a comment, either in the land use or the housing chapter tabs on the spreadsheet, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. I should point out that later on in this chapter, we do have an action item that says review and pursue local zoning changes to eliminate regulations that disincentivize two-family, three-family, and other diverse types of housing. So that action item would also address some of what Brian just brought up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
This next action item also gets at incentives, but in the sense of this addresses feasibility of development and financial incentives in particular. So identify and pursue opportunities to leverage funding or other incentives to support multifamily development in village areas. And the intent of this is to address fluctuating market conditions. We didn't refer to Pine Street here, but it was our understanding that this is really a case in which market fluctuations intervene to put a development on hold. So if at all possible, this is, encouraging the town to pursue this type of incentives to mitigate these market changes, cost of money that makes a development feasible, and so on. And some of the opportunities outlined are tax relief, capital subsidies, density bonuses, which we address again later on in the chapter, dimensional relief, decreased parking ratios, expedited permitting, reduction of land costs, brownfield site remediation incentives, and other funding incentives for housing development. Any questions about this action item? Moving on to the next one. This flexible development zoning bylaw, you've corresponded with this with Mike. So this addresses, this action item addresses that topic. Review and update existing flexible development zoning bylaw to offer stronger incentives for more compact development and open space preservation. And then moving on to the next one, unless you have questions, so feel free to stop me if you have questions. This one is, we had to change gears a little bit after the AD accessory dwelling units of the Housing Act came out. And this is sort of calling for aligning the accessory zoning ADUs bylaw to align with Section 8 of Chapter 150 of the Acts of 2024 to promote ADUs. So this is responding to the change in legislation at the state level. Pauline, you have a question?
And this is kind of probably directed at Fiona, so I apologize. To fall in line with the ADU bylaw, and it's not specifically going to be what I'm saying in the sense that in town meeting, we just tried to amend the zoning where local businesses could add dwelling units above their business. And while that's not specifically in this act, that would help support that, correct? Could that be a goal of ours to try to bring that zoning back here? Would it make sense to put it here?
Probably, I think that was that specific concept is covered somewhere in this chapter. The ADU is really not relevant to a mixed use. It's strictly an accessory dwelling to a residential principal dwelling. So that By the way, by the time the master plan is published, it's quite possible that we will have done this, as we're right now planning on having it at the Maytown meeting, but which is sort of, I mean, as we are writing this right now, yes, it's definitely an action item. But yeah, to your point, Colleen, I saw somewhere, and I don't remember off the top of my head now whether it was before or after where we're looking at right now, but that specific topic is covered here somewhere.
It is, that's right. Yeah, that we specifically talk about housing on top of commercial. And it was in the context of village mixed use, I believe. I apologize, I can't think of the exact action item, but we definitely address it. Anne Marie?
It's just 2 items ago.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
keep going, I think. Or no, yeah, let's see.
Just above that.
It's quite specific, and I know
Yes.
it's there because I was thinking that we have it here, and yet the town just recently, voted against this, but that's it right there.
Just my question was more in the sense of like, could that potentially be supporting the acts? But since the accessory dwelling units are more for residential and this is kind of aligning with commercial, I could see why they would be different.
Yep.
Yes, that new law had nothing to do with residential above commercial. There's no way we could make it fit.
Even
So
though
Dave-
I will say that the draft regulations for the for the ADU, it's who knows? It's very confusing right now, and they haven't submitted final regs, and that's kind of neither here nor there. But it calls into question, okay, are we opening, like, it could potentially open it up to these districts. So just kind of to Colleen's point, it's we're kind of seeing this play out in real time, and the state's like trying to figure it out as they go along. And it's because it could apply, to pre-existing non-conforming structures, which is like the majority of housing in every town, because they're all built in, early 1900s, mid 1900s. So anyway, don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole with that, but
It is important to know too, because they haven't addressed how Title V will come into play. And when you're adding additional bedrooms on people with septic systems, and when we're thinking about environmental impact, that is something to be mindful of, especially since they haven't covered it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should be interesting next few weeks because the law comes into effect on the 2nd. So we're all just February 2nd. So yeah, good stuff.
All right, moving on to the next one. And Gabe will talk to us about the action item related to MBTA, and that's coming up, Gabe.
Okay.
This is not the one, right? This is about barriers to 2-family and 3-family. And this is where we could get more specific about lot size and other barriers to 2-family dwellings and 3-family dwellings. And this is in response to a comment that was left in the spreadsheet as well about 2-family unit being allowed by special permit. But it's essentially the spirit of this action item is removing barriers. Fiona, go ahead.
Yeah, just to elaborate slightly further, Elena, this was increasing kind of the missing middle type of housing was a recommendation in our housing production plan, our 2023 housing production plan. So that was definitely, I'm glad to see that's reiterated here as well. We always kind of want to make sure we're coupling these planning efforts. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to the next one. This was also in response to a comment regarding linkage fees. And the action item is calling for researching appropriate ways to establish linkage fees to fund affordable housing development. And the reason we said research instead of directly saying implement is this is really market specific. So this, again, comparing markets, it would work in Boston. Would it work in Grafton? It would really call for an assessment of both commercial and residential, and a market assessment to see if something like this could be feasible and we're not causing any unintended consequences such as disincentivizing development. But we call for an assessment of that. Fiona, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was from the last time.
Oh, okay. And then, any questions about linkage fees? If not, I can move on to the next action item. Gabe can tell you more about it. This is in response to our discussion about MBTA communities.
Yeah, so I basically, based on our last conversation about the MBTA DLTA project, kind of exploring doing some sort of incentivization process to encourage mixed use residential development. I think my understanding was the consensus of the committee, as well as the planning board, was that this isn't something that is in the immediate future of Grafton. But I do think in general, it's clearly a goal of the town to get more commercial development, get more mixed use development. So yeah, this action item is basically just kind of laying out kind of the broad strokes of what we'd like to see happen. Explore the development of regulatory incentives to promote mixed use commercial and residential development in identified neighborhoods. And then we're citing unit density bonuses, building height bonuses, and fee waivers that could promote additional development in key areas of town, including MBTA communities, multifamily zoning compliance districts. So kind of just trying to get to the core of what we worked on this year regarding that. And I mean, we can try to get more specific about it, but it felt like the committee kind of wanted to keep this broad for the time being, because this could be maybe an initiative to explore in the next few years.
Yeah, it occurs to me to note that this ties into an earlier action item under goal 1. The action item was identify and pursue opportunities to leverage funding or other incentives to support multifamily development in village areas. And that's very similar to, in fact, the incentives in that action item could very well include this somewhat more specific idea of incentives. So at the very least, we kind of want to look at this and how it relates to some other action items and ultimately see that there's a connection.
Yeah, when Elena read that, I, for like 10 seconds, thought she was reading my action item.
Yeah, I mean, the tools are very similar. I just wonder if this needs to be standalone because the goal is to hint at MBTA communities. We could reword it so that we don't list the same series of density bonuses or other incentives. But does this need to be its own, or do you think we could fold it into the other one with the incentives? Those are financial incentives primarily, and zoning.
Yeah, I think one of the things that suggests to me is that, once we've kind of got everything lined up here, everything pretty much the way we think we want it, we want to look for similarities and connections. And it kind of reminds me, going back to the 2001 master plan. A few years ago, I went through that and listed every one of the recommendations it made and found a number of duplicate recommendations. Duplicates are essentially duplicates, that the same recommendation was made 2 or 3 or 4 different places. So there were something like 220 some recommendations but that boiled down to 195 distinct recommendations. And so that's the kind of thing we want to, particularly as each of these chapters are developed more or less independently from one another. We're going to find that there are commonalities. We talked earlier about commonalities between housing and economic development when it came to mixed-use village areas, and we're seeing here commonalities of the more general concept of incentives to support multifamily development, and some more specific ideas of incentives that may be tuned more towards a particular zone or a particular subset of all possible development. So as we as we start reviewing everything together, we want to see where these commonalities are and duplications are, and something may well be worth mentioning in two different places, but we want to make sure if it's essentially the same thing, or if it's two parts of what really can be the same thing, we want to make sure that ultimately we get them tied together and coordinated and consistent with one another.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we can address the redundancy in this one for sure. My question still is, do we want to refer directly to MBTA communities in some way? Is this something that we need to highlight? And David, you're absolutely right. There's some redundancies especially between land use and housing that we really address.
Yeah, my opinion, specifically on incentives for mixed-use residential development, that does not apply just to MBTA communities, and I don't think it applies differently to the MBTA zones than to any other zone in which we allow mixed use. So I think that the idea is incentives that will make it more likely for us to realize some mixed use development, wherever the zone might be that it takes place in.
Is there a different angle with which to approach the MBTA communities, or?
Not really, because the MBTA community zone consists of 5 mixed use zones, basically 2 different types. And we've taken 2 village mixed use zones or parts of village mixed use zones, combined them with 3 40R smart growth overlay district zones, and that's our MBTA zone. So it's not much of a leap to say that right now in all of our village mixed use zones and all of our 40R zones, that's where mixed use goes. And so there's very little difference between mixed use in MBTA versus mixed use in any other zone. They're practically the same thing. And there's no real need to, there's nothing unique about the MBTA zoning that calls for a different approach. Unlike other towns which have created MBTA zones out of something entirely different, we were fortunate that we had pre-existing zones that already met the requirements for MBTA zoning. So we just had to call them the MBTA zone and we were done.
Right. No, thanks for that insight. I think we should probably take this action item, merge it with the previous one. Leave that reference to MBTA communities if you think it's something that needs to be in the master plan for future. If it sets a direction that the town needs to call out, we can leave that reference in, and then merge this one with the prior action item that you called out, David. Fiona?
Yeah, just a comment that I think that the reason they were called out specifically was because the MBTA communities overlay, it kind of was more targeted toward, as Dave mentioned, it was areas that were already, the zoning already, nothing changed in the underlying zoning. We just put an overlay over it, but it definitely was targeted at areas that were already kind of highlighted for development, and where this kind of larger maybe more kind of creative zoning would come into play as opposed to the some of the VMU, where we did hear that people liked the kind of village type of mixed use with, you know, kind of maintaining the 3-story height and that type of thing. And I could be off base, but I think that's why I'm recalling that these were called out separately, is because the MBTA communities overlay districts is capitalizing on places that already are slated for kind of more larger scale mixed use types of development styles. And then the other VMU areas, the town and folks and, you know, want to see kind of not something of that scale, more kind of local character type and smaller scale type of development.
Yeah,
That
and
makes
I mean, just for the background too, like we were very limited in writing the MBTA zoning about what we could like encourage. That was kind of the idea, is like maintaining that spirit of the zoning district with the high amount of housing by right, while figuring out a way to try to make mixed use more attractive than just doing a straight all market rate development apartment building. Because the way that the state, like, if kind of thinking blue sky, if Fiona and I could, we probably would have said, oh, we should just like, oh, if you want to build this, you have to do mixed use. That'd be cool. Just put mixed use there. But the state wasn't interested in that. I don't know if that would be viable. So that was why MBTA was called out, was specifically, is there a viable workaround that we can get to encourage other types of development in these districts?
Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems to me that what I'm hearing is that the MBTA mixed use was obviously the law that was created that incentivized and made it so that you would have to do this. What we've been discussing in Grafton for a long time, you know, side by side with this decision to do the MBA by the state, is the mixed use within our villages. And that hasn't changed. So to me, it seems like it's redundant to say MBA and then separate out mixed use for everybody else as different somehow. It's don't think you need to necessarily say MBTA. You know, I don't know if that's going to what Dave already said or not, but you know, we're kind of already discussing it, you know, for various villages within our town. So, you know, why not just say mixed use and leave out the MBTA? That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I think it occurs to me to realize that the MBTA zoning actually does not put any emphasis on mixed use. MBTA zoning was about building multifamily dwellings. So it was all about fostering the development, residential development, ideally in and around or in transit areas. So it was all about residential development, not about mixed use. And in fact, some towns or some communities wanted a way to get some mixed use development counted towards the MBTA zoning. And so there was a modification of the regulations that they made to allow a certain amount of that. So the emphasis, going back to Gabe's point, that the idea of coming up with incentives for mixed use development in an MBTA district was to sort of provide an alternative, sort of a way to encourage mixed use, despite the fact that MBTA is not particularly interested in mixed use. So that's sort of where that's kind of, I think, where this came from. But going back to the other, the basic concept of mixed use development, I think, I think it's in our interest to find ways to incentivize mixed use development anywhere where we can allow mixed use development. There's sort of an example of that at 1727 Upton Street, where we embarked on that project hoping and expecting to get some mixed-use development out of it. The economics basically ended up, economics and site conditions ended up not supporting that. But with more incentives to support mixed use, that site might possibly have ended up as mixed use. I'd certainly like to find more incentives for mixed use wherever mixed use might possibly be developed in Grafton, which is primarily the other village mixed use districts. We've got a 40R, the Fisherville Mill site, which has yet to be developed. That's also, as a 40R, it qualifies for mixed use. And in fact, I think on one part of that, we actually had a requirement for there's basically two parts to that site. On one part, it's required, not optional, to build a mixed use there.
Okay, thank you for that context. So is there consensus on removing the reference or including the context that you've just explained?
Yeah.
That mixed use near transit and Grafton pretty much meets the requirement and many other goals.
Yeah, I think after looking about this and after we've talked about it, kind of leaving this, written the way it is. We're talking about mixed use development in key areas of town, including the MBTA district. So it doesn't, I don't think it detracts from this by saying that. Anne Marie?
Yeah, I think we could just leave it as it is.
Okay. Great, thanks for your input. If there are no other questions, I think there may be one more action item, bear with me here. This is in response to an item that Fiona brought up under the comments spreadsheet. This action item calls for hiring a dedicated full-time staff member to oversee affordable housing initiatives. I believe also to deal with affordable housing funding and CPA as well.
Yeah, I just maybe some quick additional, this is just, I made this recommendation because of what I've seen my day to day and what I'm dealing with. And we did do just for the working group's own knowledge, as we entered into a pilot. CMRPC had kind of a regional housing coordinator that was working with a bunch of different communities, but it became obvious in that time that Grafton definitely had a lot more going on than some of the other communities that were opting into that program. It was like Mendon was one of the towns, Berlin, they were like smaller scale towns, and Grafton was seeing a lot more activity. And I think as we're continuing to see activity, it's something that I think the working group should consider and really talk about this, because obviously recommending to hire somebody, it's a big financial decision for a town. But with new developments coming online, monitoring the SHI, doing kind of certification letters and working with the state and help coordinating approvals for regulatory agreements and LIP approvals and all sorts of stuff. I mean, really, I have had instances in like my office where I've had to just put it back, try and delegate things as much as possible, or it waits, and there's just a lot that's involved with monitoring affordable housing, and I think and I've seen communities that as they get to a certain point, this is the kind of thing that these are kind of positions that they start thinking about. And this could be, again, like longer term down the road, thought.
And Fiona, on the topic of SHI, we have the new numbers that you sent. So the EOHLC hasn't updated their website, obviously, but we can use those, right? The units are built, safe harbor is achieved. We can use that updated information, right?
Yeah, the 9.1%.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah. And we are, the ZBA has declared 2-year safe harbor, which we're in because of 116 Upton. But, as I kind of continue to caution all the time, and as you folks at CMRPC know, I mean, it's always this sliding scale that we're keeping an eye on, because if building permits aren't pulled in a year, the units fall off. If they are pulled, but they don't pull their certificates of occupancy in a year, then they fall off again. So it's just, and obviously as more units are developed in a town, the denominator of that calculation grows. So it's always this, it's a sliding scale. So I just kind of always caution about, I think that my point being is that when we're referencing that, Elena, maybe we just make it clear that it's a snapshot in time in this immediate moment, and just say, subject to fluctuation and change based on development patterns or however, you want to word it.
That makes sense. Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Anne-Marie, up.
I was just going to ask if you could scroll down so we could see the things that are included in this. Thanks.
If I may quickly to make a point about, I've seen a lot of towns that have a CPC coordinator, so maybe that's something to consider as well. It doesn't have to be maybe specifically housing, because most communities that are like Grafton, they're funding most of their housing initiatives with CPC funding, and that person kind of takes on those two roles. They're overseeing CPC, and they're specializing in housing services as well. Every community does it a little bit differently. But because, obviously this is the housing chapter, it was worded this way, but.
All right, Sue, you have your hand up?
I agree with everything Fiona is saying, except that I don't think CPA should be, I think it should be kept separate, because they don't invest a lot of money from their CPA into the Affordable Housing Trust. But I think that hiring somebody who can take care of all of this and look at the policies and bring us some actual information and facts on affordable housing and how much it is needed and everything else would be of value to this town. So I support hiring whatever we're going to call it. I can't see the name. You scroll, but somebody to do that. And yes, it costs money, but it would be worth the investment.
We called them, we didn't call them a certain title, but we pointed to their duties, which is oversee affordable housing initiatives. But
yeah,
reward that if you think it needs to encompass some specific things.
Anne-Marie?
I was going to say, just the Community Preservation Act and Committee does dedicate a fair amount of money to affordable housing. I mean, we're probably over $1 million since its inception, I think, net to date.
Maybe since inception, but yearly they only give what's required, and that's not even close to taking care of our needs for affordable housing. And I think somebody who has the time, because they aren't going to have the time, they're volunteers. If we hired somebody who could do this, even on a part-time basis, hire somebody who can look at this objectively, I think we need this.
Colleen?
So I agree with what Sue is saying, but respectfully, I think we should keep the CPA portion in there. While they do their minimum 10% required each year, they can give additional funding. So citing them as a funding source to help pay for this position where it wouldn't really necessarily tax residents anymore because we have a funding source between CPA and the trust. But the trust is not going to have they're not going to be as flush as we're used to once they're done with their 1727 update grant.
I wasn't suggesting we eliminate CPA from this discussion, but I certainly think somebody independent should be hired for the town.
Oh, is this thing, it should be somebody from CPC or using CPA funding? Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Because I think it should be using CPA funding should help support this position, but not necessarily a member of CPC.
Yeah, that's how I'm understanding it, Colleen, unlike I think how Sue is seeing it. It's not somebody from the committee. It would be in conjunction with CPC and potentially funded by that. So not a committee member or someone that's completely tied to CPC. It would still be a separate entity, but community preservation funds could be available to assist with this.
Right. CPC has an admin position, and they put aside the maximum amount every year for that position, and they don't even use half of that. So if that position was to be expanded, is that potentially what we're saying? Because there's money already available for that that's not being used.
So your hand is still up? Yeah, we probably don't need to get too deep into the weeds on that particular detail. I mean, the concept here is to consider hiring a dedicated full-time staff member to oversee affordable housing initiatives. Funding for that could come, as has been noted, from CPA, but any other overlap between affordable housing and CPC may or may not end up being appropriate or desired.
Thank you all for your feedback. In the interest of time, I think we should move on to the next item on the agenda, and that would be the prior planning. I think we covered all the action items in housing. Unless you have any other questions about the chapter.
Yeah, as with transportation, I think my notes. I have a few notes on things to add to comments that we don't need to go over this evening. But as for transportation, I'll add those to the workbook and encourage everybody else as you continue to read through this. If you have additional comments, put them in the workbook. And as Elena suggested, note them as new so that there's no confusion about what they've already looked at and responded to and what they still need to work on.
Thank you.
And now we have a new draft section to look at, right?
We do, yes. This is a brand new section. And Sarah, if you could share your screen. And I'll let Sarah walk us through this. We would love your input about what we might have missed, what maybe doesn't need to be here. Yeah.
Thanks, Elena. Thanks, Dave. This is a pretty brief section that lives at the beginning of the master plan, and the intention of this is to summarize all of the prior planning that went into the separate chapters without having those at the beginning of every chapter in a redundant way. So we're saying these are all the influences of this plan. This is everything Grafton's done for the last 20 years. So we start with the comprehensive plan and then move into more specific plans. And I think what would be helpful for feedback on this is if we missed anything, or if you think any of the plans are misrepresented, or if there are key parts of the plan that we want highlighted in this introduction section. So we start with the previous master plan. the 2005 land management plan for the Hassamanessett Woods, the 2006 South Grafton master plan, the 2016 economic development self-assessment tool, 2017 North Grafton Worcester Street report, and the 2017 North Grafton Transit Village strategic plan, your most recent municipal vulnerability preparedness plan, as well as the most recent open space plan. And the 2020 community preservation plan, and your local rapid recovery planning program from COVID, the most recent hazard mitigation plan, and the most recent housing production plan. So this is in the same folder as the chapter drafts, if you'd like to take a look.
Fiona,
Yeah, Sarah, I'll just say good job. I think this hit the key ones. You know, we obviously need to have at the very least housing production plan, hazard mitigation, MVP, open space and rec, and then any economic development studies. And I think you hit all those and then some. I would say there was the only thing, I'm just looking at the studies and reports page on the planning website just to do a quick confirmation. There's nothing left. I don't know if this is getting too specific for this section, but the bicycle and pedestrian plan might need a shout out here. That was probably our biggest transportation related, townwide transportation analysis in recent years, other than kind of our complete streets prioritization plan, which that is just essentially a list of projects that the town needs to do. It's not really like a plan like what we're trying to outline here. Yeah, I think, other than that, and we don't, and I don't necessarily know if that bike plan has to live here, or if it's just more appropriate to reference in the transportation chapter. But that was the only thing that I could see. And I think you did a good job summarizing the key points for each plan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would be super appropriate to add.
Bob Carroll has his hand up.
Hi, yes. So I'm trying to follow along here. And what's the placement for this? Where would this be as far as which chapter?
This would be before all the chapters in the introduction.
Okay.
So it would be, we'll kind of summarize it in the beginning as, these plans, influence all the chapters of the master plan rather than housing this under a specific chapter.
I don't know what other folks' impressions on this are, but do you think this belongs at the very beginning, or is it like way too much detail, and would we lose the readers having this at the beginning as a summary? So I first looked at it, I thought it was like an executive overview, right? But then I see all the background and all this history, which is good. I mean, I think it belongs in here. I'm just questioning whether it belongs at the very beginning.
We've done it both ways. In the non-chapter elements, we placed it at the end, but we still haven't established where it goes. So we can certainly place it at the end of the document.
Okay, so it's still open item.
Yeah. And I don't know that it should be in the appendix. I think it's still kind of a standalone section, might be appropriate, but we'll definitely defer to you if you think it. We can certainly place it at the end.
Okay, so for the time being, we'll just go through the narratives and the content.
Right. And if you think something does not belong there, Fiona told us about one addition, but we're, open to making more additions to this.
Okay, gotcha.
Fiona, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I think to Bob, to Bob's point, I think maybe I respectfully disagree in that I think it sets the tone for the rest of the document by introducing how, all of these prior planning efforts that Grafton has done and basically how they have informed this plan. But I do agree with Bob and that maybe we can shorten this so that we're not, as he said, kind of maybe like losing the reader more or less. I think, maybe a shortened, like, these are the plans that we've looked at, and the data from these plans and recommendations helped inform major decision making for this master plan update, and kind of maybe do it that way. I don't want to, this is the working group's document, but I'm just trying to think of something that might strike a good balance between that.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not super concerned about losing the reader in this kind of a document where it's going to have a table of contents and people are really going to be flipping to the sections that are of the most interest to them. So, I feel like people who are interested in the detail are going to want the opportunity to see it. And the people who are not are going to flip to the section that is of interest. I mean, I don't know how realistic it is to expect that many readers are going to read this cover to cover. I hope that doesn't sound as cynical as I feel like it sounded, but I think just like the reality is this is really more of a reference document, right? So if I'm interested in what influenced the document, it's in, as long as it's findable in the table of contents, it's really not relevant to me whether it's in an appendix or a table of contents. But I feel like losing the reader is probably one of my least concerns, just due to the nature of the document. So I don't know how much I would stress over it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'm not too worried about right now deciding exactly where this should go. My sort of first impression is that this could easily be an appendix, but I really haven't made up my mind. I think it's sort of, once we kind of get it closer to completion, we'll be taking more of a look at it from a readability perspective and organizational perspective. I think we've got kind of at least an approximate idea of the flow of the document throughout. Now, this is one piece that could fit pretty well in more than one place, but let's give it some more thought, and sooner or later we'll have to decide on the correct placement for it, but I wouldn't obsess over it right now. And the more important one is, have we included everything in here that needs to be here? And is there anything that doesn't really need to be here? When I looked at the prior plans and studies, Fiona already pointed out the one that I thought might be useful here, and that's the bike study. Well, bike and whatever, pedestrian and then bicycle. But nothing else, when I looked at all the past studies, nothing else struck me as something that really needed to be here. So with all that said, is there anything else on the prior planning summaries? If not, we're about at the end of the meeting tonight. What's next?
So we made some minor edits to the non-chapter elements that you've seen last time. Some change in graphics primarily. So I don't know that, especially since the meeting is running late, maybe we don't need to look at it, but it's completely up to you.
Elena, the only thing, I think it looks great. I reviewed it in advance. I don't know if other folks had the opportunity to do so. One thing that I will say, there was a couple of pictures that look a bit pixely. The specific ones I can't remember off the top of my head, and I have 70 tabs open and I'm scared to mess with it. So, but there is a couple and you'll know them when you see them. I think if they're kind of more in the middle, there's only one or two, but the rest, I think it looks great. Did a good job.
Thank you. We'll keep working on it. One section we're considering adding is collecting all the goals of each chapter. It kind of expands the non-chapter elements, but it's a nice reference to have. So we may add that and you can take a look and see if you want to keep it or eliminate it. We'll have a table of contents for the entire plan, but sometimes it's nice for the reader to see all the goals in one place.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the goals up front always help orientate people.
Right. So that with that, that's what we have for today.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see. On our agenda, so our next meeting will be February 3rd, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll look forward to having additional updated chapter drafts to review at that meeting. And the next thing on our agenda is public input. Do we have anything? I don't see any Zoom attendees, so I can't ask for public input from other meeting attendees. If any of us has anything that qualifies as public input as opposed to what was on our agenda, now would be the time. Otherwise, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded that this meeting be adjourned. We'll take a roll call vote. Mr. Carroll.
Carroll's aye.
Ms. Duckworth.
Aye.
Ms. Fox.
Aye.
Ms. Foley.
Fully aye.
Mr. Houle.
Aye.
Ms. Kimball.
Aye.
Mr. Robbins votes aye. Ms. Robbins.
Aye.
Ms. Roy.
Aye.
Motion carried unanimously. We are adjourned